I would say I'm just a pragmatic right winger. Hence,
Um, yeah. You can continue this conversation without me. I'm about to be busy for a moment.
sure, sure. Um, so do we want to start off with what do we want to define globalism again just for everybody so we get definitions straight?
Sure.
Go for it.
It, I can go ahead and do that if you're fine with it.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so for purposes of this discussion, globalism refers to not only, as we've just been saying in the discussion, not only the economic unification of the world, but a
Cultural.
society with where a cultural unification, open borders with all states, such to a point where the logical implication of it would be first a world bank and world currency, and a world government.
Or even just to some extent, even if you don't necessarily have those things, a point where a global entity has power over more local regional units.
Mm-hmm. Everything that once differentiated between states becomes either non-existent or irrelevant.
And so, Xexizy, you were just talking about it from how it'd be kind of interesting from a Marxist standpoint, because you're talking about would you be able to replace a world government more easily, you'd think, or would it be easier to try to do it on a national level for you?
Well, it doesn't really come down to the governments. What communists are concerned about are the means of production, and whether we're globalized or not, the means of production are always going to stay more or less where they are. Um, so it's more about seizing the actual factories and places we produce things. And then in terms of, so basically, when I talk about constructing new state apparatus of the proletariat in order to oppress the bourgeoisie, this would most likely be done on very local levels. So basically, I'd imagine, say you have a sub-region of this globalist empire. This sub-region would fight whatever state apparatus, that being the police force, for example, that exists in that area, fight them off, and then construct their own people's militia in order to defend their new established society. So I don't really think. I mean, yeah, it will probably make differences because obviously a globalization compared to how we live today is going to be very different. But whether or not that really has huge implications for the question of revolution, I just can't really say.
Okay, I see what you're saying. And then, well, then let me ask you this. Would it be more beneficial to the workers to have this free flow of immigration for them? Would that make it easier, in your opinion, to seize the means of productions and to try and oppress the bourgeoisie, or would that make it harder then?
I don't really know how immigration plays into the question of revolution, to be honest.
Well, I mean,
Well, I think what he's saying is the people who revolt have to come from somewhere. I mean, would immigration directly or indirectly affect how fast that revolution occurs based on the number of people available to actually start the revolution?
That's I really do think that that kind of comes down to the specific contexts of the time. Like that's just very difficult to really pin down. Because the thing is with these things is you can't really predict how or when they happen. And also like in terms of like the people available, well, I mean, in all parts of the world, we're going to be producing things. And where we're producing things, obviously there are people. So there are always going to be people available to revolt. I don't know if it's a question of how many. But I mean, yeah, it's so kind of abstract that even when talking in relation to the society we have today, predicting how revolutions might function is a very difficult task, let alone doing it in an abstract imagination of a society from there on. It's extremely difficult.
Well, I certainly agree with that. I guess, would you say it was, I mean, this is probably an oversimplification of Marx's view, but I mean, it was my understanding that Marx's view was that once the revolution would take place once the poor, not to say that he ever defined specifically what, like, once this line is crossed, then it will happen, but he more or less believed that the revolution was inevitable once the poor reached a certain point where they were so oppressed they couldn't take it anymore, and that would I don't want to say he necessarily said inevitable, but many people do characterize his view that way, as to say that the revolution was inevitable once the poor felt they were oppressed to the point that that enough was enough.
He definitely said that revolution was inevitable. I don't know if he hinged it all on like the oppression of the poor as such, but I think because there is a lot of misunderstanding to do with that, and there are lots of different explanations that can come into play as to why he thinks communism is inevitable. It's not all to do just with the concept of revolution, but because he said, he talked about how there would be an increase in disparities between the rich and poor, but he didn't necessarily say that the poor would become more oppressed over time, right?
Right.
And in that sense, in the gap between rich and poor, he is, I'd say, very vindicated. But you know, that still doesn't mean that the working class today, what we consider the working class, still don't have higher standards of living than they do, say, 100 years ago. It's just in comparison to the property owners, that gap between them is still infinitely larger, even though they still have a higher standard of living. And that's what Marx talks about, because he talks about social standing rather than kind of like objective standards that they have.
Okay, and so I guess let me frame it in this way as well. Do you think, because the only current semi-globalist organization I could somewhat think of off the top of my head would be, say, the EU, and I say semi only because they're not pertaining to the whole globe necessarily, but there's an element.
Might I interject? George Soros Open Borders Foundation.
Yeah, that kind of thing. Would you say I mean, I don't want to bring George Soros into it because that's a whole nother mix, but would you say that you're supportive of what's happening in the EU currently, like with their lax kind of standards on immigration and that sort of deal?
Immigration is a question that I haven't really devoted a huge amount of thought to, but in general, I definitely think that immigration as a concept is often kind of pinned by the media to divert from other bigger problems. But at the same time, to say that immigration doesn't cause any problems at all for the working class is false, obviously. Statistics show that, like, aggregate, immigrants do help the economy. However, on a local level, immigrants can hurt workers economically in the short term. The only problem is, well, basically just a supply and demand. You know, bigger increases in demand, wages go down. Bigger increases in supply, rather. Yeah, wages go down.
Right.
So while a worker who may be out of a job or has lower wages because of that, you can turn around to them and say, well, in the long term, this is good for the whole economy. I mean, they don't really care about that. So obviously, I think things should be done to do with to counteract that, to compensate these workers who are losing wages or losing jobs because of immigration. But to necessarily say that, you know, we should stop immigration because of that, well, that actually would hurt our economy aggregate in the long term. So I mean, Sean and Jen has a nice video going over this. I think it's in response to Black Vision Speaks on one of his videos on immigration, but I might be incorrect there. But he has a nice video going through all the statistics and all of that to show you what I'm talking about. But to be honest, like, yeah, immigration, it's just not it doesn't tend to be at the forefront of my mind, so it's not really something I've really fleshed out a huge amount.
Fair enough. I guess the other aspect of the whole globalism debate would be distinctions and culture and negative effects of trying to ignore that in order to integrate everyone into a semi one world system, or just like that whole kind of mess. It's hard to say, but I'll ask both of you, like, what would you say are there any negative consequences in your mind to mixing I'm not like mixing cultures or having various different cultural groups kind of forced together, because that's kind of how governments are doing it nowadays. They're not exactly making an attempt to ease people into this. It's kind of shock therapy in a sense. And so do you see that having any long-term negative ramifications?
Well, I'll jump in. I would say yes, absolutely. In as much as if you look at the vast cultural differences, say between people coming from the Middle East or the previously homogeneous populations in Europe or the United States, if you I mean, there are a lot of specific things I could point out, but the cultural differences are so great that when you look at, like, for example, just Sweden or Germany, or all the issues they've had with refugees raping women, which stem from, you say, the cultural differences between a majority Muslim country under Sharia law, vice Western country with Western values. It would seem those two cultures are just simply incompatible on their face. Either one side or the other has to come to an understanding of some sort, or they have to remain separate. But you can't have the two different cultures trying to operate as they did in the same context. Just isn't going to work. That would be my opinion.
I mean, this topic is always weird to me because, so what do you propose, like, so what's being done now specifically to do with multiculturalism you don't like, and what would you propose to fix that? That's what I've always kind of wondered on these things.
I would say that the negative effects of multiculturalism are that when you have two groups from such different cultural traditions with different value systems and different perspectives on morality. I mean, whether or not you regard morality as objective is kind of not the point. The point is that people have subjective interpretations of it. And when those different subjective interpretations don't necessarily mesh, it becomes a kind of state where, it's artificially inflated, it's artificially produced conflict. Whereas if each of these cultural groups had stayed in their regions of, where they previously resided, then this cultural conflict wouldn't necessarily be a thing. But because things like mass migration are currently occurring across the world, you're seeing more of these conflicts. And the other negative effect is that it's often the native population and the native culture that's being uprooted to supplant, to make room for this newer one, which causes even more problems. There's a lot of, I just looked up a fairly decent sized body of work, and it all talks to how the cultural diversity thing, like the whole diversity is our strength thing, is really more or less of a myth, in that culturally homogenous societies tend to function much, much better. And so there are negative societal ramifications, such as, increases in crime, not necessarily even from the incoming culture, although that does tend to be the case, but just, you do tend to have a ethnocentric reaction of the native culture that will spur on a little bit of crime as well. And then when you throw into the mix institutions such as the welfare state, where now the native populace's taxes are going to this new cultural group who they don't necessarily like and may resent in some cases, that's even more conflict. And so in that sense, I'd say those are kind of the bigger downfalls of the multiculturalist side of globalism.
Okay, and
Yeah,
if I could
so
just give I was just going to give a specific example quick. There was an article I read. I'm looking for it right now, so I'll provide it if I can find it. But it was about Dearborn, Michigan, which specifically has a large influx of immigrants from Muslim countries. And what they found, at least some of the immigrants were doing, was practicing under Islamic law, practicing polygamy. There was a man who has 4 wives. Each of his, of course, in the United States, he was not legally married to these women, but under his faith, he was. Each of them had a different apartment. He would go from apartment to apartment, acting as the husband to all four, having children with all four. All four women were receiving welfare checks, and then the more children they had, the bigger the welfare checks get. Essentially, this process continuing after a while results in the immigrants buying up more and more of the housing space, still practicing this. These people are not working. They're receiving money from the state in order to reproduce. As they reproduce, they're getting more and more money, and it ultimately resulted in the entire neighborhood now being majority immigrants, and the public schools, the public services end up taking on that national identity rather than an American identity.
All right.
That's just one specific example.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think the question of welfare or housing is really a problem. When you I could go on some anti-capitalist rants, but it'll probably get us way off topic. But so really, yeah. So the question of culture and multiculturalism is just not something I particularly care about, and that's not to say it doesn't hold importance. It just doesn't interest me, and because of that, I don't kind of look into it in the slightest. But what I will say is that obviously, I think liberalism and liberal values and that they should be upheld, and we shouldn't make way for them for non-liberal values. I don't think that but I think a lot of it comes down to the actual conditions that these people both come from and then are living in, because a lot of the time you'll find that say crime, for instance, it correlates quite strongly with poverty. So it's kind of what I'm getting here. So like basically, these people, for instance, refugees, if they're coming from war-torn areas and then they are living in ghettos or wherever in that country, then it's just kind of natural that they're gonna not be the most socially what's the word? I can't think of the word. Whatever. You know what I'm talking about here. So
Yeah, no, I get what you're saying.
So really, I think there are a lot of other ways to look at it, other than kind of like just stop them all coming here, and I also kind of think it's I do get the feeling a lot that it's kind of blown out of proportion a lot as well. These kind of issues, but again, I'm sorry, I'm just not really the person to be talking to about this in the slightest. Like,
I know
there are
I
much
know.
better answers out there than what I'm giving. These are just kind of like my general thoughts about the topic. Clearly, you
Yeah, we
guys have
kind
done a
of
lot
put
of
you on the
research on
spot
this,
with
but
this.
it's fine.
Yeah,
It's fine.
and
It's just like if you decided to put me on the spot about a specific part of Marxist economics, that'd be fine. But like, this is just not something I've ever read about or engaged in debate about before ever. It's just but I just I'm trying to think of like where else you can go to get a decent leftist perspective on this.
What I miss?
A kind of a lot, but
we just kind of swapped some thoughts back and forth. Nothing major.
yeah. But I guess one comment I might have on the whole crime thing, there's definitely a case to be made on how poverty correlates to it, and that these immigrants are certainly coming from a lower socioeconomic status, and they're going to and that's going to be kind of maintained even when they enter the country. Although there's also, especially within, there is to some degree, especially amongst different immigrant groups, the availability to move up in class. Like, one generation normally doesn't stay in the same social class as it was born into. There's something from the Brookings Institute. I know Ben Shapiro has referenced it a couple times, but it's like chances are that if you're born in the lower 20%, within one generation, you will have left that or so. And so there is that opportunity, but even
What is that for immigrants as well?
I believe so. I'm not a huge fan of the Brookings Institute, so I haven't looked into it, but I believe it's the case. And, it does vary depending on where they're coming from, because there are perceptions that people have to deal with as well. I'm not going to deny that. But there's also the fact that sometimes, being that there is, discrimination, even in Western countries, it's not horribly rampant at the moment. I think we might be able to agree. And so sometimes when immigrants do stay poor, it's not always simply a matter of necessarily the fact that they're being put down or that there is sort of something holding them down. It might be simply a matter of, again, their cultural values not allowing them to function properly within the system. And I guess that would just be another point to why multiculturalism necessarily isn't capable of integrating people as well as I can't say I just naturally if of their own free will.
Okay, and I might add, uh, this is once again an oversimplification of how the immigration system works. But generally speaking, if a state says to immigrants at large, come over to our country, we'll give you living spaces, food to eat, and a fat welfare check, and you don't have to do anything. You don't have to get a job or anything. I'd imagine hordes of immigrants are going to start coming over. But if they come in under the assumption they're going to live, they're going to eat, they're going to get paid, and they don't have to work for it, well, I don't imagine they're ever going to feel compelled to start working so long as that money keeps flowing.
There's definitely a parasitism of that element.
To what degree do you often talk about, for instance, corporate tax evasion?
Could you say that again? Sorry.
To what degree do you usually talk about corporate tax evasion compared to the degree that you talk about immigrant welfare checks?
Okay, now when I want to clarify, you're saying tax evasion as in illegally not paying your taxes, not tax loopholes?
No, the other one, tax loopholes, where they pay like 1-2% tax.
I would
that
say
would be avoidance, wouldn't it?
Yeah, well, tax evasion is illegal. If someone commits tax evasion, they will be arrested.
Yeah, okay.
It's probably, I would say that I think, taxation is stupid. I think even it's more of a matter, I mean, corporations are in a weird situation because I think we can agree corporations are a completely state, brought about institute. Like if you want to just talk about general big business, that's one thing, but corporations in specific are legally created institutes by the government that receives special economic status. And so they kind of, they're receiving an unfair advantage no matter what angle you're looking at. If we're just talking about general big businesses, though, kind of, what's up?
Here.
Oh,
nothing much.
We're
just joined the Hey, how you doing? How you doing, comrade?
I'm doing good.
Yeah. Okay. What's the current topic, just so I can get caught up?
Hey, Stephen Hayek.
Taxes.
We're just we're.
That's my shit, dude. That is my shit. Okay, cool. All right.
I'll just.
Oh yeah, no. Basically, I mean, my point is that so someone was talking about how big welfare checks go to immigrants and stuff, and my general kind of view on that is if you're concerned about where kind of government money is going to and coming from, then really your first point of interest should definitely be corporation tax, because that's the majority of profits being made in the country not being taxed on, which is obviously where the majority of money is going to come from.
The thing about the corporate tax, they redistribute the taxes.
Right,
hold on for a second, Monsignor.
Hang on, can we have one person at a time, please? All right.
Okay. Well, first of all, whenever it comes to income tax, I mean corporate tax, keep in mind that whenever you tax certain corporations higher because of their larger revenue and income, it's actually creating a barrier to de-incentivize other businesses from growing. So that's the first thing. And then second of all, we shouldn't have yeah, it is, because now nobody's going to be incentivized to even become a large corporation in the first place, because you're going to actually lower their returns. So you're not going to gain that much more money.
About government spending.
Well, I think, hold on, Hayek. I think the point with corporations, big business is one thing, and I think we talk about big business, but corporations in particular are government created and to a large extent government sponsored institutes. So they're always going to have an unfair competitive advantage within the market because
would corporations not exist without the government?
Yeah. They wouldn't last that long in the free market.
Well, it's not that big business wouldn't exist, but the specific legal institutions of corporations would not exist without a government, because they receive special tax exempt statuses. They receive special lower risks, because one of the things you learn in like really early on in econ is that the formation of a corporation implies a reduced risk, because the government is going to help bail you out if the corporation ends up tanking. And so it kind of incentivizes worse investing. It incentivizes malinvestment to a certain extent because they know government is going to bail them out. But I think we're getting a little bit off topic here only because we were talking about this in relation to the migrant status and how if they receive welfare, what should our concern of migrant welfare be versus the extent to which corporations kind of get off scot-free and without government.
Well, first of all, corporations aren't people, so we shouldn't be comparing them to people, and that's our main mistake right now. Is that we're saying look at what the migrants are doing with welfare and the taxes, and then look at what the corporations are doing. So I think that's a false equivalency.
Okay, but just to take away from the point that if we're concerned about government spending, we should close tax loopholes to get more money.
Yeah, and that's something that everyone in this entire discussion actually agrees on is closing the tax loopholes, except for the ANCAPs who don't believe in taxes.
Yeah.
So
right,
well,
but then why isn't that talked about more?
Hold on, let Xexizy talk.
It seems like a more pressing issue because it's infinitely more money involved. I see this so much in Britain, where people are saying, the reason the NHS is overburdened is because there are too many immigrants, so we need to cut immigration and the NHS will be okay. But then if you actually, look at where the money from the NHS should be coming from, that being, taxes, and then the fact that most corporations in England pay fuck all in tax because they abuse loopholes, you realize that immigrants aren't really what we should be talking about, because the extra strain that immigrants even, they give back more than they take out, but the extra strain that any immigrants are going to be putting on public services is insignificant compared to the money that we're losing from not taxing corporations properly. Well, I'm just talking about priorities here, really.
Yeah, but the priority shouldn't be to redistribute wealth from the surplus of the corporations, because corporations shouldn't be paying for someone that they don't know or they don't associate with.
Well, and that's the problem. Think this is because you've come in later in the conversation. You're kind of missing the context of why I brought this.
Okay, cool. Okay, if I could just make a quick, I was the one who brought up the issue of welfare and immigration initially. The point I was making when I made it was, if immigrants, regardless of whether or not this view is supposed to be true in a technical sense, if immigrants have the idea that if I immigrate to this Western country, they will give me a place to live, they will give me food to eat, they will give money to buy what I want, and I never have to, and I don't need to get a job, nor will I ever have to get a job. I can just go there and live as I please, and other people will pay for it. I'm saying that gives a massive incentive for immigrants to come over and not ever seek and not ever try to work.
I will say though that I don't think that's too much of a problem when immigrants are still good for the economy on the long run.
Well, and also, coming from
living on welfare, it's actually we have studies that show people are much more depressed when they live on welfare than when they have a job, because obviously people like doing things, having purpose in their lives.
Oh yeah, definitely. I think.
But again, the thing is.
You finish.
Immigrants are good for the economy. So talking about how terrible it is that they're not putting into the economy is kind of irrelevant, because they are.
Coming from
they need to put into the economy. They can't just be on welfare and not have any form of a job.
Yeah,
I understand sometimes there's a case where they are on welfare and they still have jobs, but in order for it to be good for the economy as a whole, they still need to be producing more than they're taking out in taxes, is what I would say.
Yeah, and Monsieur, can you let Monsieur say what he wanted to? I mean,
sorry, Voltaire, you go.
Just saying, I just watched How to Argue for Immigration Restrictions from Shane Killian. His point was that immigration create 2.1 jobs for natives, according to Say's law. I could link the video if you want to. I thought that was an interesting point from the video.
Yeah, you can put the link in there, but I think what we're not taking into account is that if you look at the counter studies regarding immigration, which is that which is the fact that even if they're working, their work is usually considered non-taxable income, so they're not paying the return in taxes as much as they're actually taking out of it. And this was really the Ronald Reagan type of mentality where the people who are benefiting the most from taxes should pay into it, and that's why immigrants should pay taxes, is because they're more likely to be on welfare, so on and so forth. So yeah, you can put that link in there, Voltaire. I'd love to see that.
So you basically support amnesty then, student Hayek?
I actually support open borders, but only if we abolish the welfare state.
Yeah.
I support open borders, but only if we abolish capitalism.
Well, you'll have to wait till 2066, whenever profit is gone.
When we finally achieved post scarcity.
Yeah.
Only can happen under capitalism, not socialism.
Well, all right. Hold on. Let's stick to the globalism debate.
Yeah.
No, the whole idea is that post-scarcity is achieved through... Post-scarcity is antithetical to capitalism. Overproduction is capitalism's main downfall.
We're in
disagree.
territory here, so let's stay away from that.
Well, I think let's try to reframe it in what the original discussion was, which was we were talking about like the necessary some of the effects of multiculturalism and how that goes down. I did actually just find a paper because Xexizy did bring up a good point that it doesn't necessarily, just because you're from another culture doesn't necessarily inclinate you to crime depending on where you go. But there are, there's other factors like poverty. And I did just find, I think I can link this study for free, but I printed it out at my college, so I'm not sure. But I think I can check. It's called, it's from the Social Science Research Institute. Elsevier. It's a British institute, but one of the things that the paper focuses on is that even when you control for things along the lines of poverty and varied socioeconomic status, that when migrants do end up coming to the country, there's still a negative disconnect in terms of values, in terms of that migrants tend to uphold less the values of the native country, and depending on where they're from, that could mean illiberal beliefs. And on top of that, there's also that it doesn't, when you have this artificial conflict with the natives, then you have more crime that way. And so I just thought I'd bring that up. I can send, I believe if I can find the study for free, I'll send it to you.
Before we go on, can I find out who's on whose side? I'm pretty sure the ANCAPs are on the same side, but Pragmatic and Xexizy, are you globalists or nationalists?
I'm neither. The guy comes to me as a false one.
Oh, okay.
I guess I would say nationalist for sure, but I'm trying to, seeing as we're at a lack for globalists at the moment,
well, you're not really going to find someone who's like.
Well, I mean,
but then they wouldn't even call themselves a globalist to begin with.
Like the word globalist is a buzzword, just So I might be considered a globalist by some of your definitions, but that's, again, I don't consider myself one because just it's a buzzword. So,
well. I think it also comes down to the difference between simply economic globalization and then actual proper globalism, like the Alex Jones nightmare type of deal.
Alex Jones.
Free brackets, globalism, free brackets.
Why, actually, in your video, why you said the globalists in your videos?
What do you mean?
Just that you do that as a joke.
Oh, well, because globalist is often a buzzword or like a replacement word for Jews for a lot of people. It's just funny.
It was the Jews.
I mean,
yeah.
I think there's definitely a certain case to be made for not the Jewish question, just that George Soros in particular. I think, being that we have nothing else to talk about, we might as well talk about George Soros. He's
and David Rockefeller.
And David Rockefeller, sure. I don't. Although are the Rockefellers even Jewish though?
No, they're American, pure American as you can get.
Well, American is not an ethnicity.
Well, you're
like that's kind of the point,
Like,
I don't.
Okay, they got
I
deep
don't believe the
Christian
Rockefellers
roots.
are Jewish. No, I'm gonna quick look that up, but I don't believe they are.
I mean, there was a theory going around that Hayek was Jewish, and that found out not to be true. So
was he a Catholic?
I don't know, but let's stay on the point. Globalist is, especially if you see the word globalist in 3 parentheses, that's an anti-Semitic way of singling out the Jews. but I'm not sure if everyone who uses the word globalist non-ironically means it that way. And that might even be like a minority of people, but it's definitely a thing. So
According to what I'm finding, Rockefeller was part of the Northern Baptist Church, so I'm guessing he wasn't Jewish.
Yeah, that'd be kind of weird if he were a part of a church and Jewish. Well, what is do communists have any specific quarrels with like George Soros in particular, or what is the general...
Well, in that he's a capitalist.
Okay.
Well,
I guess so.
to the free market advocates and libertarians, they view George Soros as a dangerous corporatist with too many connections.
Well, yeah, but he like owns means of production. I mean, so he's a capitalist.
Okay.
He's not a
I mean,
capitalist.
I don't care if he's Jewish. He's going up against the wall in Jewish.
I feel like
actually, why do Marxists don't like this distinction between capitalism and corporatism, as many libertarians point this out?
Sorry, communists. The actual issues we take are the same, regardless if it's capitalism or corporatism or whatever it is. You know, we attack the very core of commodity production itself, which very much takes place under corporatism and capitalism. So it can be a completely free market, but Marxist capital is going to be perfectly valid in either this instance. In fact, Marxist Capital, Volume 1 at least, was written assuming an optimal market. Optimal free market.
Voltaire, because like the only difference to a communist between corporatism and capitalism is that one is larger, but they're both involved in the act of exploitation and theft from the wage laborer. So that's what I mean.
Yeah. Why? I noticed this between Marxists, especially Marxists. Why you often tend to have a very historical, deterministic view on history, saying capitalism will fall due to the falling rate of profit and due to a variety of factors. But given
let's not get into this. This is kind of off the topic of globalism a bit.
Well,
Voltaire,
globalism does have a root in Trotskyism.
What?
I'm sorry.
Do
you mean fucking hell? Do you mean internationalism, and by that, like permanent revolution?
Yeah.
I
okay, that's just like so like unrelated. You couldn't be further from the original.
Have you, Voltaire? Have you been switching the words internationalism and globalism?
Not really. I tend to distinguish internationalism with globalism.
Okay, so would you consider yourself an internationalist as far as foreign policy goes, but not a globalist, more of a nationalist as far as things like, you know, immigration and trade go, you know? I'm more of a nationalist when it comes to foreign policy. I do believe in open borders, but like you said, I want the welfare state to be gone so it can be like a viable thing.
I do think that there is, I mean, obviously Trotskyist internationalism is separate from what we would consider globalism, but you could make the case that the U.S. is using kind of their own internationalism that is kind of serving at the same time the interests of globalists, because with constant intervention happening, there's constant displacement of peoples and constant migration. So you could say that some internationalists who try to, you know, subvert the outside forces for their own needs are at the same time playing into the hands of globalists. Would you say that's not an unfair assertion, Xexizy?
I mean, I guess on the face of it, I can't think of anything particularly.
They are dirty capitalists. Really exploit people for profit.
Yeah, I mean, you can't deny exploitation does happen.
I have to hear that question of yours again, Pragmatic, so that I can put some of my input on it.
Oh, okay. I was talking about how unwittingly, I mean, it doesn't have to be Trotsky internationalism, but internationalism in the type of like neoconish form where it's like George Bush occupying like 2/3 of the Middle East, or Obama continuing it, or just all this foreign intervention does somewhat even if unwittingly, serve globalist needs because it's displacing people, thus, forcing sort of a mass migration and some sort of artificial cultural exchange that wouldn't have happened otherwise, and kind of forcing multiculturalism into the center stage. So I think,
well, what are the globalist needs? Because the fact is, I support conceptually many of the neocon ideas. I didn't support individually the policy of going into the Iraq War. So that's a particular policy. But I do consider myself more on the neoconish side, especially with things like liberal and conservative internationalism. So, but that's only because of my belief in American exceptionalism as well that perpetuates those policies. But again, what is globalism like? Like, what are the globalist needs? Is that like a group of chairmen up in the top tower, 1,000,000 feet high, who are like, snarling and just waiting? Like, what are they?
If I may interject, I think, as we've already pointed out, one of the difficulties in this discussion is we don't really have anyone who's representing the globalist side per se. But it always seems to me that the what really defines globalism would be a one world banking system with a one world currency, and that you might argue necessarily would require some form of one world government.
I wouldn't even necessarily say a one world banking system. I do think that's somewhere in there, but even along the lines of just a single kind of formal or informal entity that is making decisions beyond the control of local regions or nation states or what have you, and that kind of thing. And so, like you asked about globalist needs, one of the needs in order to kind of subvert the nation state and that nation state mentality is the forced, intellectual interjection of multiculturalism, like George Soros is doing with his various different institutes that he set up across Eastern Europe to kind of promote the open borders mentality in various different European countries. I know he's come into conflict with Orban in Hungary a whole bunch of times over that sort of thing.
Okay.
Why
So
the hell do globalists want to subvert our fucking national values or whatever though?
Well, it's necessary in order to. You can't have nation states and globalism simultaneously. So in order to subvert the values that in order to subvert the nation state itself, it starts with subverting the values that it was built on and, kind of destroying patriotism in a sense, ethnic pride or cultural pride, and, destroying, any pride you might have in your heritage. And so that's where the destruction of the nation states kind of really starts.
But those things are actually ridiculously useful for the ruling class though.
For the ruling class in a national kind of frame. But if you're talking about a ruling class that's trying to integrate a global ruling system, then it wouldn't necessarily work for them.
Why would they want to? Hey, yeah, but if this is something purely economic, then surely people's sense of culture doesn't really matter, because we can have a world bank and a world currency and everyone can still jerk off to their fucking ancestry if that's what they want.
Well,
I would say, if I could use the example of, say, Alexander the Great, for example, when he conquered a territory, what's one of the first things he did? He established an academy.
That is just not the same thing at all.
Well,
that's more of imperialism.
That's imperialism. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
that's
yes,
not the same. This is actually
move on from this subject.
Force to subjugate a country that know they're being subjugated. They've just had their country defeated in war. Okay, and then are having all of these things forced upon them instantly. Okay, and then this is literally just economic policy, and that's all it is.
First of all, things like trade between countries and war between countries is beneficial to certain economies and rulers, and is not beneficial to others. And we have to have that. To an extent, there will always be that constant conflict in order to ensure that certain people are perpetually in power. I mean, look at mutually assured destruction going on with the U.S. and North Korea. Really, the purpose of that is to gain political capital. That's why North Korea is making all these threats that they're not actually going to go through with. But that's something that would actually be perpetuated regardless of globalism. I mean, the entire globe, some of the complaints that you guys are making are reasonable, but then some of them are lopped in with the nationalist narrative in an attempt to paint globalism as more of a conspiracy theory than an actual economic and political theory.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's
I
actually
was getting that feeling as well. Hayek.
I actually have a video on this. It kind of touches on the subject. It goes over cultural Marxism in general, but I do touch on the swarming countries of immigrants to control everybody better or whatever. When
Well,
I mean,
that's
especially seeing as when historically, and the ruling class, they make mistakes, but they're not fucking idiots. Okay, they know that historically, when you flood a country of immigrants, this leads to very high rises in national identity and nationalist movements, and leads to right wing populism. So actually, the sense of national identity is only increased as immigrants have come in, as a reaction to immigrants coming in. Okay,
it.
and it's not like the ruling class wouldn't know that this would happen. They're not that short-sighted. The reason that this is happening is because there was inevitable imperialism due to capitalism being capitalism, and this is just chickens coming home to
Imperialism
roost.
predates
And,
capitalism. Imperialism predates
well,
capitalism. But also keep in mind,
that doesn't
yeah.
go in contradiction with my point. But either way,
Well,
okay, if you want to disagree with why it happened nonetheless. We've had intervention in the Middle East. That's caused destabilization. And now, again, this is chickens coming home to roost because of that. We can't do anything about that now. It's already happened.
Well,
This
keep in
isn't
mind whenever
something
it
that was
comes to the
orchestrated decades in advance.
whenever it
Come on.
comes to the Middle East, I actually agree with you that it's not orchestrated in advance. That's why I'm not on board with the conspiracy theory. But I don't agree with you that we completely it was all the U.S.'s fault that the Middle East is completely destabilized. If you look
Well,
at the
no, I
actual,
never said that. It's the USSR's fault as well. It's loads of different faults. I mean,
okay, cool,
fucking
yeah,
well, I
the
think
Middle East is such a clusterfuck.
yeah,
I think
I will take that
if,
answer. I'll take it.
if we're going to talk about a ruling class, though, and what they'd want, I think it would be in their interest to consolidate power under a global institution, only because having these various national identities to worry about and trying to have all these different groups maintained within their borders is inevitably tough, because eventually you can't sustain a government permanently. That's why government collapses ever, because it runs out of money to tax. It runs out of money because it can't keep taxing people, and it runs out of wars to inevitably expand its tax base. Because I mean,
Can I ask then, why is it historically that ruling classes have tried to promote nationalism among the working class? They
well,
do
it
that to
depends on
distract the
who you're
working class
calling a
from
part of the
real
ruling
issues.
class. Because I mean, the
Uh,
ruling class is a somewhat undefined, nebulous term. Because there are certainly some political leaders who will try to take advantage of national identity in order to use it for their political benefit. But at the same
No,
time,
not
you
no, no,
can.
not even political benefit. Yeah, I'm talking about when you have, for instance, what do you think is better for those who own property? Having a working class that is focused only on class struggle, that being the entire workers versus the entire property owners, or having a working class that is divided along nationality, that being countries against countries regardless of class. It is infinitely better for the working class to be fixated on everything but class. And that historically, we see this happen time and time again. We see even today, liberal identity politics is actually a huge way of Hillary fucking Clinton. She goes, "We're breaking up the banks to end racism," and then there's the resounding no, no. So this shit happens both on the liberals and the conservatives. Okay, the ruling class do not want the workers actually focused on class interests, and they will bring any identity, whether it's progressive or reactionary or conservative, into this to distract them from it. And this has happened in history time and time again.
Well,
Well,
So
Hayek
to say
has
suddenly
an
that they want
entire
to get
chapter.
rid of all of these identities, completely one goes against all previous behavior and all previous understanding of why they do what they do.
Well,
Well, Hayek, yeah, you first.
identity and economic class aren't necessarily separate, and I'd say in most cases they aren't.
Well, they are.
Well, a part
Because
of
your
a part
class,
of
let's define class real quick. For a Marxist, a class is simply your power of the means of production, whether you own that property or you are selling your labor power to work on that property.
Yeah, well, I think all right. Well, we have our first major kind of disagreement there, because I think I think everybody else besides you on this chat would agree that that's a far oversimplified version of chat. Not to mention
The
that
goal of an employee is to own capital. Plain and
I,
simple. Just plain,
and I
plain and
mean
simple. Yeah.
the distinction between personal and private property is something we've had to discuss too. But just to try and avoid that for just a second, I think you mentioned a valid point before, where that economic status isn't completely separate from identity and race, because like you said, when we're importing all these immigrants, it is definitely negatively affecting the lower working class in the short run. So as much as it might be a nationalist kind of sentiment that they're trying to take advantage of, if the
if the country isn't at the same time serving the economic interests of the class, it's also what they're focused on. Because half of it isn't just a concern over identity. I'd say for most of the right wingers in America, it wasn't identity for the reason why they voted for Donald Trump. It was the fact that they're also being economically subverted by these migrants who also happen to be subverting the culture and so forth.
Funny thing
Exactly.
about that, though,
So wait.
statistics kind of show otherwise.
Well, keep in mind, whenever a nationalist tries to persuade the working class, they're trying to persuade them through economic methods via nationalism. So what did Hitler promise people who were not Nazis? Things like universal healthcare, things like a form of socialized services, and these are things that are generally considered to help the working class. But he said on one condition: you have to follow the fascist narrative, and that's really the entire point of the nationalist sort of trying to get the working class. So it's not a black and white thing. They try to accomplish both, but it's more of an ultimatum rather than just a pro working class type of deal.
Okay.
It's pretty
Yeah, I mean,
interesting.
fascists have always historically co-opted social democratic policies, and the whole reason that the Nazis retained socialists in the name is because you have to understand they were around at a time when there were literal socialist insurrections happening. Socialism was extremely popular with the working class, so they used that to, garner support, and because people didn't know what fascism really was at the time, so they co-opt these social democratic policies like the free
Sure, they
healthcare
did.
and everything.
There were actually 3 or 4 actual Marxists who founded fascism within Germany at that time. Actually, it was the earlier 1900s before Nazi Germany went full fascist. But actually, fascism depended on the necessity of those Marxist scholars to actually work in Germany. I'll find their names soon, and if I find them, I'll go ahead and bring them into the chat. But
Okay. Now I was going to talk about something else before that in response to something else, but I completely forgot. Oh yeah. It was something to do with class, wasn't it? What were we talking about
Probably.
before?
Well,
I mean,
I don't
yeah,
want
I
to
mean,
get too much.
I don't see how your power over the means of production is tied to your identity in any.
Can we move
way,
off
shape,
from
or form.
class struggle, please? That's a totally different discussion.
Well, I don't. Well, again, I don't think it is necessarily, only because class and immigration status. 95% of the time, when you're an immigrant, unless you're moving out of a country with a massive amount of wealth from that country already, like you're a factory owner who just wants a better life in the United States, chances are you're going to be a part of the lower class.
Well, that's
And
just
so
correlation equals causation.
it's not necessarily correlation equals causation. It's just that when you have these, I'm trying to think back to my original point now. When you have a subverted lower class and a subverted working class, and you're playing to their national economic interests, it's more or less of a thing where, you can use that for however long, but at the end of the day, you know, Hitler's policies worked for only a certain amount of time, and eventually, this isn't really talked about, but Germany ran itself into massive fucking debt even prior to the war, and that's why and that's part of the reason why Hitler needed Lebensraum, because he needed he needed Ukraine, he needed the breadbasket of Eastern Europe, and he was hoping to get to the Caucasus for their massive oil reserves. Like, a lot of these things are economically unsustainable, and so again, you will have inevitably kind of a focus on a class struggle. But I think if you were to focus really hard on class struggle, you would see that it's not necessarily, as you would say, the capitalists who are trying to kind of perpetuate it. It's more, government stifling economic progress.
Hey, Louise.
And I think that
I don't
maybe
think I really understood what you said there.
Hey,
Okay.
Xexizy. Oh yeah, Xexizy. Have you seen Jason's video on
I have. And it's atrociously bad. Yeah, this
Can we
kid.
actually speak about these globalist organizations like the UN, the EU?
Hold on, I'll briefly try to summarize that word salad I just threw together at the last moment there. So I guess this has to inevitably return to the capitalist thing eventually, but more or less, you're going to find that the ruling elite are trying to stifle economic growth to keep people down, but they're not using a capitalist system to do so. They're using the government to keep capitalism from, fully breaking free. Because again, I get this. This is just what capitalism v socialism would be. capitalism is the optimal system for alleviating poverty, I would say.
I think most of us would agree, except for
I could literally go on for a week about that. That is, I really just feel like that.
Well,
like,
there is
Xexizy has a
data
ton.
to prove you
Xexizy has
wrong.
a ton of videos of counter arguments with that, which I will debunk in the future. But yes, he could go on days for that.
All right, well, let's
Actually,
all right,
I think I
agree,
debunked
agree
you
with,
about the scratch shots in my first video.
Well,
Yeah,
let's
I
save
think-
it for a different debate.
Yeah, I agree with Voltaire. Let's move on to like actual globalist organizations. We'll just have to agree to disagree on this one.
Yeah.
you
Just
know
like-
what? I couldn't really stay long anyway. I probably stayed longer than I should have. I've got shit to do, honestly.
All right.
So yeah, it was fun talking to you guys. I will
Thanks,
say
man.
I apologize for not really having anything significant to say on the topic of multiculturalism. There are definitely leftists out there who do. It's just not my area of expertise in the slightest, because again, it's just not what I'm dedicating my small amounts of time to actually learning about. If any of you don't watch Sean and Jen, I'll link his recent video on immigration on the Black Christian Speaks. And while it is more economic, I think it's still good to watch anyway, and it kind of gives you a. I don't know.
before you
could you throw
all I can say in general, good general tips in life is watch Sean and Jen every day, and then watch ContraPoints every day, and you'll be pretty much set up for.
Oh, God.
is that the link you just put in the chat?
I've just put 2 links in the chat. Yeah.
Yo,
Xexizy, before you
Xexizy.
go, I'd
Thank
like
you
to
for
know
putting
your
up with
view
us.
on the European Union.
I'm a bit torn on the EU. I mean, like, to me, it's a capitalist institution, and like, for instance, in regards to whether England should have stayed or not, I mean, I was a bit on the fence. I did vote Remain purely because I'm a physicist and I'm likely going to be going into research, and the EU funds research immensely. So now, if I want to go into research, I'm going to have to move abroad, which sucks. Well, maybe it doesn't suck that bad. No, I don't know, but yeah, in regards to whether the EU is a good thing or not, I mean, like, I don't really know, but ultimately, it's like it's a capitalist institution that I would abolish the very underlying fabric of that society to begin with. So it's like, yeah.
Okay, I just want to know your view as a European.
Xexizy,
Thanks,
before you go, check out a channel called True Dill Tom. He has some pretty good pro-capitalist arguments you might want to check out.
God.
Cool, thanks.
All right.
Thank
Have
you
a
for
good one.
putting up with us.
All right.
Can I say something quick? Never mind.
Any thoughts on the European Union?
If I could just offer quick, I had the privilege of visiting several parts of Europe last summer, and what I found, this was a Romanian I was talking to. I won't give his name just for the sake of his privacy, but his opinion on the European Union was the people who are for the European Union are usually from countries where lots of money gets funneled to those countries via the European Union, and those that are against it are from the countries that lots of like for example the UK. Why did they leave the European Union? The people who voted to leave said because the European Union is not benefiting the UK. They're just taking our money and giving it to other countries. I don't remember if it was Poland that they were saying specifically receives a lot, or maybe it was. I don't remember. There was one country that he told me about that in particular receives a lot of EU funds. So
Germany.
Okay, so I guess those that are opposed to the European Union, I would say because the European Union is really just a scheme for redistributing European wealth.
I really like to know about the bureaucracy of the European Union, because what I know is that I've spoken to several people who claim to be from England. They don't like the European Union or Angela Merkel because it's such a bloated bureaucracy. They don't really represent the people or the national interests of their other nations, you know.
Okay, and I would say pretty much any system where you consolidate power and give a small group of individuals a large group of authority over larger groups of individuals will inevitably create a system that is, slow and unhelpful. There's the word I'm trying to think of in my mind. It's not coming to me. Inefficient.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting.
What's the current subject again? We're the EU.
Yeah. What's your thoughts on the EU? I want to know your viewpoint.
So the problem with the EU is that really, I don't think it should exist. I think what we need is the UN, but a revised UN, and that's it for anything international. I don't think the EU is necessary. And really the only reason why Britain faced financial hardships from leaving the EU was because the EU was there in the first place. I hate whenever people use that argument. Oh, well, the pound went down in value. Well, it turns out that the pound wouldn't have to go down in value if Britain was never part of the EU in the first place, or if any country was never part of the EU in the first place. We should just disband it. And really, in regards to international relations and trade, all we need is a revised version of the UN to focus on bilateral and multilateral agreements in trade. So that's what we need.
Yeah, that's a pretty good solution, my friend. My personal view on the EU is it's a very bloated bureaucracy. It has too much authority and power over sovereign nations, and they can impose their rules against people. All that. Just a very layman view of it.
Can I state something, because I haven't got a chance to speak my views?
Yeah,
Go ahead.
Like, the idea of the European Union was formed in good intentions. When I'm talking about good intentions, I'm talking about the European Economic Community from the 1950s, in which Luxembourg, West Germany, France, and Belgium form a union in which they trade. What horribly wrong was it shifted from a trading alliance into a nation, or a union, in which you don't have to where there's open borders, and that Europe is one single entity. They even attempt to form a single military. And then what really destroyed the EU, damaged it, was the formation of the euro. When France and Germany ditched their currency and joined the euro craze, and then when the financial crisis occurred, the euro dropped in value. So, and as a result of that, you got Spain is a shithole, Greece is horrible.
Lewis, do you think everywhere, all the other countries are eventually going to leave the EU?
I know Italy once tried doing that under that prime minister that was impeached for degeneracy, but was undemocratically replaced with some other EU advocate. My predictions, I know France had their election, but they decided to elect some stupid progressive who had a
who's a cat to Angela Merkel.
That's a fetish for old women.
Ew.
I have a feeling that Poland might leave because they have their own identity.
I've heard some rumors about Poland and Germany. So
I don't know about Germany. Germany is Germany is one of the big, they're prospering because of the money they gain from being a member of the EU.
Lee, I have to ask, how hard is it to broadcast from the bunker you're currently in?
Yeah, for real. I know he's probably going from his phone. Are you on your phone, Lewis?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
All right, that explains it.
Hey, I actually have to go, guys. But it was nice talking to you.
Nice meeting you, Hayek.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah, thanks so
We'll
much.
see this again in the future.
Of course. Yeah. All right. Have a great time.
Peace.
Because if the EU is going to collapse, the euro is definitely going to be a factor into it. And also, onto the point, I think Italy will leave.
Yeah, definitely. Italy, Poland,
because
or maybe Greece.
Well, I feel like Greece is still too economically dependent on them, even if they hated EU austerity, the EU is their gateway to the IMS inflation money, which is the only thing even roughly keeping them afloat. So
My theory is that the EU would split into different entities, like the Western European Union, and like sort of like the Roman Empire would split into 2 and 3 into 4 until it collapsed entirely. Like I know I know Scandinavia has their own trading partnership with like Finland, Sweden, and Norway, and Iceland.
like new Roman Empire when though?
That's the fifth Reich, because Germany is like one of the biggest players in the EU.
Yeah, I mean it's essentially like Juncker is like or whoever the new head is. He's half a puppet to Merkel, honestly. But honestly, okay, I'm sorry. I thought the fire alarm in my building was going off. Half of the reason
I want refugees into the new nation, and I give you to show. I just showing my big fat titties.
Yeah, I'm just gonna mute you.
I feel like half of the reason Germany stays though is because it wants to make those other nations economically dependent, and I feel like that half plays into the whole globalism thing. Like, obviously, like most European countries can't sustain the mass migration, especially because they're horrendously large welfare states. And then on top of that, by making them independent, economically dependent on a faction that's beyond their national borders, there's legitimacy to like claim at some point in the future, should one of those nations enter like a national crisis or something, that the EU has to step in and take control, or yada yada yada.
Yeah, and I know everyone objected to my use of the imperialistic example earlier, but I feel like globalism is in some ways imperialism, but without the military element. Rather than taking control by force, they manipulate control through economic means or whatever other means.
Yeah, I mean,
definitely
honestly,
voluntary imperialism.
Well, it's not voluntary because the states are still enforcing this mass migration and the forced learning of multiculturalism and all that stuff. So, I mean, I kind of agree. I feel like it is sort of imperialism, but like in a cloak almost.
Yes, like rather than uniformed soldiers with weapons marching in and taking over, it's more of a subtle takeover through manipulation and coercion.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on the UN? Like me personally, I never did like the UN. I always thought it was a very corrupting organization. It could also, I don't like the fact it can impose laws on these other nations.
Okay. Hey guys, this has been a great discussion, but I also have to get going. So let's talk again in the future.
Yeah. Any thoughts on this pragmatic culture?
NATO, they were necessary, honestly. They had a purpose back in like the 50s to honestly combat Soviet expansion and the expansion of communism, but largely I would say it's useless now because at this point it's just there to provoke Russia at this point, which I think is useless.
Yeah, just any thoughts on this, Zorro?
Well,
Replace NATO with some sort of new organization of nations to combat terrorism. so that as an organization that not only everyone would join, but including Russia.
Well,
Something that,
I agree. There's something that would be very useful in having a joint agreement with Russia to actually combat terrorism. Unfortunately, I mean, realistically thinking, I'd like it to happen, but it's not going to. But then I feel like there's also the other half of it where I don't know what I was going to say. Never mind.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think we've neglected only one minor. I think we've forgotten one major key in the whole globalist conspiracy, though.
the New
Rockefellers?
World Order. New World Order.
No, not even that. We've forgotten about the dreaded Nazbol gang.
I
Oh,
never
boy.
heard of that.
Nazbol gang.
Nazbol gang is coming. And
Nazbol party. It's not you and me. Nazbol party.
what the fuck are you singing, Louis?
Some stupid song by Boko Revolutionary. Some.
Yeah,
Uh,
let's see. I wish I was there. I wish I had a more active role in the conversation. I was doing some things for my mom.
I mean, your mom was clearly occupied by the Nazbol party recruiters. Have you
national Bolshevism is just a meme in my opinion. Matter of fact, the founder of National Bolshevism, Alexander Dugin, actually ditched the ideology. If you didn't know, like the political group went too the political ideology went too crazy.
Well,
or political party.
I feel like it was a meme. I can't like the first time I ever heard about National Bolshevism was fucking that cancerous hellhole of an app, iFunny. And it's kind of like a meme in the same vein of like automated luxury communism.
You don't like how I find it that much.
It's an ideology that both like neo-Nazis and commies or tankies really don't really get, because it triggers the Stalin apologists like the Nazis and shit, and then they go like have a Vietnam flashback of World War II and the atrocities committed by Germany. They sort of like forgot about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and it also triggers the Nazis because they view like the Soviets as some sort of Jewish globalist elite. Like, oh my God, they're answering Jewish Bolshevism.
The fascists say that capitalism and communism are Jewish ideologies.
Yeah.
Murray triple parentheses.
By the way, I'm not anti-Semite.
I'm not a fascist.
I thought we also wanted to talk about the preservation of culture a little bit.
Yeah, I have a good point. Yeah, I was actually thinking early today. We have to be in the middle. Like, we should preserve the culture, but you can't go too far or too little. Like, you don't want to be in, because it's important to protect culture and traditions and values, but you don't want to go too far in the sense like Iran, in which it's like a 1970s time warp, and that it's a theocracy and it's gender segregation. Women are not allowed to drive. But you don't want to go like full blown anti-culture. Then you're gonna go. Then you're just gonna be like China under.
I'm just gonna end this stream right now so we can continue talking about this.